My body and my mind naturally overcouples her death with loss. My orientation of what I focused on was losing her. I'm wanting to slow this down so we can hear this because it might sound obvious. But yeah, Louise, of course, that's what death is. Death is loss. And I'm making this episode to question, is it? Why? Our body and the somatics of our body teach us so much about these states that are unconscious to us. And what I'm learning is death is just as much about gaining as it is about losing. Welcome to the Holistic Life Navigation Podcast, where we explore life through the lens of somatics. I'm Luis Mujica, a somatic educator who teaches people how to find safety in themselves. Your turn to learn begins now. I believe that grief is love that has nowhere to go. So there's that scene in the movie Magnolia, and it was the first moment that I understood this, and I felt it in my body, and it made sense to me. And in this movie, there's this moment where there's this childhood TV star. I forget the actor who plays him. And he grows up and he ends up getting braces because he kind of falls in love with this guy who is I think he's a bartender who also has braces. I think it's been 20 years since I watched Magnolia. Let me think. It's been almost 20 years since I saw Magnolia. So I'm trying to remember this piece. I remember the soundtrack very well. I was an Amy Mann fan. So I remember the soundtrack. But there's this just amazing moment where something very surreal happens in the movie where it starts to rain frogs. And this, I'm going to call him Johnny Whizkid. That's what I'm remembering his name as. Johnny Whizkid is an adult, and I think he's pumping gas at a gas station, and he kind of hears these frogs, and he looks up, and one hits him right in the face and breaks his glasses. I think it breaks his nose, and it kind of disrupts all the work his braces had been doing. It might have like broken a tooth or something. And it's just this poignant moment where he walks up to, I think it's Brad, this guy that he's in love with. All of my not sureness is slowing down the story. But essentially there's this moment where he goes up to this person and he goes, I have so much love to give and I don't know where to put it. And he starts crying. And whoo, just thinking about it, right? I feel it. And I remember at the time when I was watching this movie, I was going through one of the greatest griefs of my life. I was 16. No, yes, I was 16, and my grandmother had suddenly been hospitalized because she passed out. And it turned out that she was on prescribed medications for pain that became addictive for her. And she was mixing them with over-the-counter meds because the pain meds were ruining her digestive system. So she was taking things to ease her gut at the same time as these pain medications. And they actually created somewhat of a poison in her body. And within a few days, she went into multiple organ failure. And there was this 3-month span in the hospital of one thing after another happening to her body, preparing ourselves for her death. And then she would miraculously survive. And then finally, as she was surviving the multiple organ failure and coming out of it, she had a severe stroke that left the whole right side of her body paralyzed. This was huge because this woman that I looked up to and loved so much and was kind of the rock of the family was suddenly paralyzed and emotionally, psychologically regressed back to more of a childlike state. So she completely transformed. And I remember just as this was happening, being struck with grief. It was just so painful to have this loss of this person. And then I'm watching this movie with, at the time, my really, really dear friend and mentor who would teach me a lot about life. His name was Andy. And he's showing me this film, and I see this part where this Johnny Whizkid says, I have so much love to give, and I have nowhere to put it. and he's crying. And it gave me this felt sense of what I could only have language for in the last few years, thanks to somatics, where this charge builds up inside of us, right? For everything, whether it's love, whether it's joy, whether it's pain, whether it's embarrassment or fear, there's a charge that happens in our bodies in response to life, in response to living. Activation. It's unavoidable. It's a part of being alive. Some activation solicits or elicits expression. So if I feel the activation, like when a comedian makes a joke, one of those really good ones, which is usually they're politically incorrect, they're irreverent, and it's what everyone wants to say and they're afraid to say. And this person makes that joke and you feel that charge come up and laughter comes out, right? That's something easy for the body to do. Grief is a little harder to be with, because this charge that we're faced with is actually our love for this person or experience that we're seeing as lost. So all of my love for my grandmother that I could give her, suddenly I couldn't give it to her because she was unconscious. I remember sitting next to her bed and staying the night with her in the hospital, and she was laying there just in a state of, literal comatose, as she was withdrawing from the oxycodone and other things she was on, the painkillers she was on. She was withdrawing from them, and it was a good 10 days as she was in a coma state and kind of screaming at the same time. It doesn't make sense to people listening, even to myself as I recall this story. But I clearly remember her being comatose and then going into a withdrawal. But she was unconscious. It was very interesting. She couldn't talk to us. Her eyes weren't open. She was sleeping, but she was screaming, as these withdrawal symptoms were happening to her. And I remember sitting there with her and feeling this well in my body, because I was used to hugging her. I was used to kissing her. I was used to laughing with her. I was used to having this certain relational experience. And if you think about someone you really love and you feel that love in your heart build up, that love propels us to call somebody. It propels us to hug someone, write them a letter, say something to them. It propels some kind of action. Love in and of itself isn't an action for me. Love is a more embodied state and presence. And from that state comes these actions. When someone is dead, or the friendship is dead, or they move far away, that feeling in our body, that spectrum that happens when there's this pent up love charge, there's a spectrum of how that shows itself to us. It starts as, I miss you, that feeling of missing. Then it goes into like, I'm longing for you. That's a bit of a more overwhelming, deeper sensation. And then it's, I'm grieving, right? Heavy sensation. It's so heavy it could shut you down. And I find that to be really profound, because as we navigate grief, which we're all going to experience at some point, because everything and everyone dies, it has to, it's part of life. As we navigate grief, what I've been learning more and more in my beautiful membership space with people and in my own life is how grief is often the result of death being overcoupled with loss. So I'm going to say that again so we can feel into it together. Grief is often the result that comes when we overcouple death with loss. So I'll fast forward to my grandmother's eventual death. It took place 6 years later. She ended up dying of cancer when she lived in a nursing home. And so 6 years later, she died, right? My body and my mind naturally overcouples her death with loss. My orientation of what I focused on was losing her. I'm wanting to slow this down so we can hear this, because it might sound obvious. But yeah, Louise, of course, that's what death is. Death is loss. And I'm making this episode to question, is it? Why? Our body and the somatics of our body teach us so much about these states that are unconscious to us. And what I'm learning is death is just as much about gaining as it is about losing. And I want us to feel into that together so we can kind of play with this idea and see if it's true or not for us. So, what's interesting about the body is it has many different parts to it, right? Different parts experiencing the same event. So, one event is going to be experienced different ways in my body. For instance, I'm taking myself back to my grandmother's death, okay? I'm seeing myself in the room. It was 2 weeks long. It was brutal. It was a painful, painful death and a very graphic one. And I'm seeing myself attuning to her death, to her pain, to her suffering as she was dying. That was my story. She may not have even been in her body, but that's how it felt at the time for me. And as I'm attuning to that, so much of me gets activated. I remember being there and almost passed out. I had to leave the room to kind of collect myself because it was so graphic. And as I was attuning to her experience, her body's experiencing of death, parts of me were resonating with it. They were matching it. Parts of me were constricting. Parts of me were hyperventilating or not breathing at all, going back and forth. Parts of me were shutting down. Parts of me were filled with charge and pain and fear and terror, right? I was really looking and matching her state in my body as best as my body could. That's somatic empathy. And there was another part of me, a more subtle part that was hard to feel because of these really big parts, that was so excited for her, excited for whatever was next for her, excited for the ancestry of death. We all must die. And we die in ways that we approve of, and we die in ways that we disapprove of, but it's all death. We end up dying. And there's this lineage that was coming through as I was watching her and sitting with her of all who died before. And their death had to happen for my life, even. That's how nature works, right? So there's this part of me that was triggered, that was longing, that was grieving, that was scared, all these parts. Then there was another part of me that was relieved, interested, humbled as hell when you're watching a death, and honored to be able to hold space with her and my family. I ask you to check this out with me right now. Think of a death you've experienced, whether it's a friendship, a human body, an animal body, a plant body, the end of your youth, right? The end of a job you really loved, a personality, a behavior, a role you played, any kind of death. And notice that there's parts of you that are going to constrict, embrace, and feel pain and feel overwhelmed and unpleasant sensations, anxiety, even grief. These are the parts that are experiencing a loss and attuning to the loss. They're not the parts that are experiencing a gain and attuning to the gain. Now, what's really profound about this for me is our attuning to the loss, right, means we have to attune to the past. We're oriented toward what happened. Our attuning to the gain is orienting to the now. What's life like now? What has this death opened up or changed in my life now? Notice when I say loss and past, and I say gain and present, this is not about good and bad. It's very easy to go into the binary of right and wrong, good or bad, better or worse. I want to go into the awareness of past and present, and past is part of the loss, and present is part of the gain. I did lose something in death. That's the nature of death. And the equal nature in death is I gained something. I'll give you an example in nature. My wife and I were in Massachusetts the other weekend, and we were walking along a country road, and we saw this hawk being chased by crows. And so we walked into the field and we found this deer, this body of a deer that had been dragged from the road because we followed its fur. It seemed like it had been dragged by coyotes or wolves. And its body was broken open from the teeth of these animals that had found it. And its bones and ribs and throat and organs were just these bright, beautiful, blossoming like rosebuds and flowers in this very cold field that had frost on it. It was a gorgeous image. And as I was sitting there watching this deer's body, and my wife was collecting some fur around the area for her own purposes, I was attuning to this understanding of the gain and the life that is inherently part of death. The death of this animal and the remnants of its body as proof, as residue of really the art piece of nature coming to sustain itself, feeding off of this body. The very bones and blood and fur bodies of these other creatures get to live another day because this body died. There's an inherent gain in death. We see this in mushrooms, in compost. We see this in the forest when the leaves fall and die and create this new fertile ground for things to stay warm underneath. Death gives us something every time. Where we get overwhelmed and confused is, again, our orientation, our attunement gets stuck on the loss. So our minds, our hearts, our bodies stay focused on what we lost, not on what we gained. This is parallel to the pattern that occurs with trauma in general. My body continues to reverberate toward what happened decades ago. It's unable to catch up to what's happening now. So my body lives in a biology, in a state of remembered threat, and it stays braced because of that. Our bodies bracing teach us when we're out of time, unless there's something in front of us directly impacting our livelihood, our lives, like right in front of us, not figuratively in the world or metaphorically, but in the space we're in as you hear my voice right now. If there's a threat in front of you and your body's bracing, it should. If your body's bracing and there's nothing around you, maybe there's stress, that's totally understandable, but there's no threat to your life, you're overcoupled. Part of your body is in a protection mode. It believes that something bad is going to happen, and it's preparing to protect itself. When we're grieving, when we're kind of stuck in a state of grief, when we're existing in a state of grief, what we're really experiencing somatically is all this charge from the attunement of what was lost and the inability to simultaneously feel what was gained. And I want us to just, again, feel into that together. This is not spiritual or emotional bypassing. Bypassing would say, get over it. There's nothing to worry about. Look at all this great stuff you have because of the death. This is holistic integration. This is, can I hold the loss and can I hold the gain? Can I honor the loss and can I honor the gain? When it comes to death, we tend to only honor the loss. We tend to only honor the sadness, the longing, the painful stories of what should have or shouldn't have been. That's where we tend to orient and attune and even communicate and relate with one another from. What if we played with bringing some of that other part, other pieces, other ideas in? Why is this a beautiful thing? What am I learning from this? What has this gifted me or our world or the people around us? How was this a gift for the person who died? Camille, our community manager and assistant teacher who's on the podcast often with me, and Marika, she has said before that she would hear someone say no one should have to bury their child, and in her mind she would hear the inquiry, why not? And it's such a humiliating, humbling inquiry because we have this separation from the laws of nature as humans. We have the privilege of being separated because we can build things. We can create electricity. We can make a certain comfort for ourselves that's incongruent with the seasonal changes or the geography. And because of that, we might also think that we are separate from death. We might not think about death very often. It might not be part of our daily awareness, our honoring, our practicing. So when it comes, it's quite a shock. Like, whoa, we can die. Well, they weren't supposed to die until dot 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 dot. When in reality, the liberty of being a human, part of that liberty is we all may die at any point, whether we approve of it or not. That's humbling. Now, humbling can also be terrifying, depending on how you see death. I'm not as afraid of death, so it's very humbling and kind of exciting to me to think, well, I'm part of this spirit that takes us. I'm part of the spirit that brought me in. It's all one amazing, strange, mysterious ride. What's it like to honor death as gain so that when my death comes, I also know I and other people are gaining something through it? What story am I going to tell about my death leading up to it? What story do I tell about other people's deaths? When people come to me and they say, Luis, I really want to work on death. Can you help me, heal my fear of death? And I say, no, I can't until I know how well you respond to a traffic jam. How well do you respond to a friend not agreeing with you? How well do you hold transitions in your life? If I think I'm going to a party at 10 o'clock and I get into, I don't know, some kind of issue and I get there at 10:30, am I riddled with shame? Am I rushing? Am I worried? That's how well I do with death. Because death is a transition, one that we don't have control over. And depending on what I overcouple with it, whether it's the death of I thought I was going to be there at 10:30 or it's the eventual death of my body, they're all connected. So we have to start in really slow ways. We have to start by titrating in this practice around simple everyday deaths that we face. The death of a day. What happens when the sun goes down? The death of my expectations of you. What happens when who I want you to be is not the reality of who you are? The death of a friendship. How do I hold those things in my body? Am I attuning to the loss or am I attuning to the gain? This can be a constant inquiry that will help you find pretty deep, amazing spaces in you that are highly incongruent with societal norms. You're not going to find a lot of support in this, probably. Maybe you will. Maybe I shouldn't even say that. How do I know? In my experience, it's not normal. And when I say these things, people are often shocked by them and then immediately interested. And they can feel it in them. They can feel there's a truth to this in their own body. This isn't my truth. This is an ancestral wisdom. This is an earth wisdom. It could be a galactic wisdom for all I know, a universal wisdom, that everything must die and there's a gain from the death. They're all one movement, right? One experience. So I'm going to walk you through a short practice. I want you to identify the death of something. And try to use something that isn't too overwhelming to start, depending on your relationship with death. If you have a good relationship with it, you've been practicing these things, go to whatever death your mind or body take you to. But just start noticing what's something that has ended, the death of something that's hard for me. We want to really go to something that's hard to accept. How do we know it's hard to accept? My body clenches. My mind goes into what should have been. I feel a sense of panic or overwhelm when I think of it, right? So notice this thing and notice the place inside of you that constricts. If there's many places, just choose one. And as you choose this one, put your hand over it. If you're able to reach it, if not, you can send your breath there or just have your mind's attention there. This is the place that's constricting. This is the place that is attuning to the loss of this death, that's attuning to the past. Or if it's an upcoming death, it's attuning to the future, but it's not present. So feel the bracing as proof that a part of you isn't in the present, and we're not changing it or judging it, we're just noticing it and holding space with that part. And then look around your room and look at something that settles you. Look around whatever space you're in, inside, outside, in the car, on the plane, wherever you are, and just look, where is there something here that is beautiful, that's safe, that's funny, that's pleasant? Right now, where is it? And where in your body can you feel that? And really take a moment to notice, what part of my body feels something in my current reality that's pleasant. And what does that feeling feel like? And put your hand or your breath or your attention there. So there's one part of your body that's bracing in response to this death because it's attuning to the loss, past or future. And then there's a part of you that is not bracing. There's an opposite sensation, a place that's attuning to the moment you're in right now. From this right now place, this place that is embraced, this place that's kind of nice and pleasurable to be with, ask that place, what did I get for this death? What did I gain from this death? What space was created from this death? And if it's a future one, you can ask the same thing with a future question. What will I gain from this death? What space will be created from this death? What am I invited to do because of this death? And let this place inside of you that feels the present moment give you the resourcing to go into this inquiry and let the answer emerge. We're not trying to answer it ourselves. We're asking, and then we're waiting to see what meets the answer, which is the internal wisdom inside of us. It's not us, right? It's something in us coming up and giving this to us. So you want to take your time with it. And the goal here is not to stop grieving. The goal here is not to love death. It's none of those things. I don't even know if there is a goal. It's more of an exploration to test out for yourself. Can I feel a part of my body that attunes to loss and how that feels around death? And can I feel a part of my body that attunes to gain and how that feels from death? And practicing being with these two contradictory sensations and perceptions around the same event, death. I'm going to close with something a member in our membership shared. I was just loved. It was the perfect example. They were grieving this forest they would visit because I guess machines had come in and leveled off the forest, just removed all the trees. And they were going there and attuning to these stumps, to the loss of trees, and they were grieving. And they did this practice with us, and they went there and they noticed when I attuned to what's gained, I looked up and there was a sky. I couldn't see the sky before. I lost the trees and they felt in their body where that loss was, and I gained the sky and they felt in their body where the gain was. That's a person living in their reality, honoring what has happened and now being fluid and flexible to honor what's happening now. And this practice, even though we're looking at it through the lens of death, honoring what has happened, honoring what may happen, and being in relationship to what's happening now, that's what tends sanity. That's what tends to our trauma release and our stress release and our vitality, our happiness, our joy, our ability to live life regardless of what it brings us. Attuning to what's happening now gives us a direct relationship to our agency in the moment and the reality of our experience, rather than having it overcoupled and confused and overwhelmed with past and future. That's the end of today's episode. Now let's take a moment to notice where we feel the episode in our bodies. Close your eyes. Take a breath. And let whatever wants to come up, come up. And remember, those sensations hold the wisdom that we're looking for. If you want to go deeper, visit holisticlifenavigation.com.